going to be very intimate. I think it's also willy-nilly going cool with the topic. It's going to be a very intimate setup. Nevertheless, thank you for coming. João Florêncio comes from University of Exeter, and he's got a background in performance studies, I would say, personally, but also he's teaching visual culture. This is one of his main domains, and as far as his work is concerned, he's preparing a book manuscript on a topic very, very similar to the one he's going to discuss today. And if you don't know, tomorrow there is another event. Me and him will speak at the Skopje Film Festival, so if you have friends who are interested to come for this other event, where we will speak about the history of queer cinema. That's tomorrow, and I don't need to speak much else because this is supposed to be intimate.
Yeah, I'm going to be reading the.
Yeah. Okay. And then we can have a chit chat about the topic.
So I think what I will do is what I want to do is kind of to look at masculinity in contemporary kind of gay porn. That is produced in kind of so-called post-AIDS contexts, and porn that kind of eroticizes the exchange and the accumulation of bodily fluids. And so I want to think about the idea of like masculinity as porous, and the masculine body as penetrable, in the context of this kind of porn, but also in relation to issues of to kind of developments in HIV care, kind of around kind of undetectable viral loads and PrEP, and to show how those kinds of masculinities that are being mediated in porn relate, or may perhaps be kind of new. Make trouble hegemonic understandings of masculinity, whilst at the same time also maintaining some of kind of masculinity's hegemonic traits. So kind of trying to think about the male body in a kind of a pre and post AIDS context. And I'll be focusing on Treasure Island Media, so the kind of San Francisco porn studio, and particularly then I'll be looking more closely at the video called Viral Loads that was produced in 2014. So since its creation in San Francisco in the late 1990s, Treasure Island Media, also known as TIM, has become not only one of the most controversial gay porn studios operating in so-called a post-AIDS world, but also one that has received a lot of scholarly attention. TIM's popularity is certainly due to the particular way in which it embraces bareback or condom-less sex, presenting the exchange and accumulation of bodily fluids as well as the potential risk as the targets of libidinal investment. I should also, you didn't do your disclaimer, there's going to be porn stills. Yeah. So the infamous popularity of such scenes is, however, not only a consequence of what we see men getting up to, it is also the result of how articulate Paul Morris, the founder of the company and one of its main producers, has been every time he has spoken publicly about the work. For instance, in a speech entitled "No Limits, Necessary Danger in Male Porn," which he delivered at the World Pornography Conference in LA in 1998, Morris defended his work by positioning it as documentary filmmaking, as a trustworthy record of contemporary gay male sexual practices. Distancing himself from the work of gay porn studios like Falcon or Titan, which he regards as producing hyper-real fantasies with very little truth content, Morris claimed that that the positing of sex and eros as things that occur in hyper-real worlds removes them from the mess of viruses, germs, test results, imperfections, and real intimacy, physical or emotional. Sex worlds like those of Falcon and Titan are arid paradises that are inhabited by unexcited actors who move through tableaux that call for replications of sex. The safety that is enabled through the creation of other worlds for perfect sex is a safety of relative lifelessness for the viewer. So the hyper-real safety that Morris diagnoses in what was mainstream porn in the 1990s was in his view created through its depiction of perfect bodies, hyper-scripted and staged sex scenes, and most importantly its use of condoms. All of those being features that for Morris are at odds with the real lives of gay men, that mess of viruses, germs, test results, imperfections, and real intimacy that he's looking for. So in an offensive waged against mainstream porn of the late 90s, Morris decided to set up Treasure Island Media to document what real gay sex and intimacy was supposedly about. That is the embrace of risk and the rejection of condoms, which he saw as political and transgressive sex. Accordingly, barebackers were to him the legitimate heirs of the gay liberation movement, due to their refusal to abide by the codes of behavior that had made gay sex acceptable to mainstream culture. His porn videos were therefore put forward as documentaries of the ongoing gay sexual revolution against assimilation into hegemonic straight morality. Still, Morris's role as a documentary filmmaker is not as straightforward as he claimed. As porn and media scholars like Linda Williams, Laura Kipnis, Fiona Atwood, or Susanna Passonen have argued, porn is less about documenting reality and more about producing a reality effect, thanks to what Passonen describes as a complex interplay between authenticity and artifice. Porn is authentic because, after all, it is a record of sexual acts that have indeed taken place, but it is also artificial in as much as each scene is performed and often specially lit for the camera, with performers and cameramen positioned in such a way as to grant the viewer maximum visibility and a mediated sense of physical closeness to the action. Their view is also shared by Tim Dean, who, despite accepting Treasure Island Media's porn as an ethnographic record, nonetheless still acknowledges the ways in which its documentary aesthetics depends on a series of particular pornographic techniques that, as he writes, betray the impotence of visual alone to capture raw sex. So techniques such as subtitles describing what cannot be seen, as in here, compromise money shots, so that's what he calls when the top pulls the dick out in order to make the ejaculation visible. Reverse money shots when the bottom pushes out the cum in his rectum, unedited ambient sounds, and cameramen intentionally visible in the shot, and even the occasional presence of the director's voice speaking off camera as the action unfolds are all stylistic decisions used to produce and reinforce the intended effect of documentary realism in Treasure Island Media's porn productions. However, what strikes me in Morris's 1998 speech, delivered only 2 years after antiretroviral therapy and viral load tests were introduced to successfully manage HIV infection, is that it shows an understanding of contemporary gay male subjectivities and sexual practices, as well as their politics, taking place at the intersections of the body with viruses and bacteria, medical discourse and clinical practice, and pharmaceutical research. More recently, in an interview with Susanna Passonen, Morris expanded on that point and on Treasure Island Media's role in such a context, and he said that TEAM is two things basically. We are developing and living archive of real male sexual experience, and we're a laboratory that performs experiments that the men involved in our community propose. You could say that we're a genetic laboratory exploring the vital sexual symbiosis of human and viral DNA. For the most part, gay porn pretends to represent experience without peril, experimentation without damage. Most gay porn hides behind a facade of safeness. But in my case, the men in my work are considered and prized for being damaged, for having taken what conservative gays deem the ultimate risk and lost. In a world increasingly dominated by the medical gaze, to willingly live in symbiosis with the virus is seen as irrational and socially expensive. I see it as necessary and revolutionary. So with this statement, Morris claims teams porn to be more than an ethnographic record of the sexual practices of 21st century gay men. To him, team should also be seen as a creative and future-orientated and necessary research enterprise invested in the production of new form of symbiogenesis, whereby human and non-human bodies not only touch one another but fuse together. Bareback sex becomes team's research method for experimenting on the limits of our bodies and what they might one day become. Now, it is likely that Morris's statements are a crucial part of the very successful marketing strategy of his studio, through which he sells dreams of a transgressive sexual utopia, at least as much as he sells pornography. Still, his idea that each HIV seroconversion might lead to new forms of human viral symbiosis is not so far-fetched. As studies in immunology have shown, the incorporation of retroviral genes into human DNA is an observable phenomenon that hints at the coevolution of humans and retroviruses. For instance, in an article published in 2004 in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, Frank Ryan notes how as early as the 1970s, scientists had already identified retroviral genetic material built into the genome of mammals, including humans. Thanks to a long process of coevolution that involved the incorporation of viral genetic material into the germ cell lines of human hosts, some retroviruses developed a survival strategy based on vertical rather than horizontal transmission. In other words, the genes responsible for coding the synthesis of viral proteins became part of the human genome and started being passed down by parents to children. Through that, ancient retroviruses stopped having to infect new hosts in order to secure their own replication. Instead, the survival of their genetic material was secured by human reproduction. Given that those ancient retroviruses were highly contagious viruses similar to HIV before they became part of the human genome, it is not hard to imagine a possible, albeit distant future when HIV could become written into our own human DNA, another step in the coevolution of humans and retroviruses. Such a possibility also makes sense in light of recent studies on acquired immunity, which argue that in order to be successful, pathogens need to balance their virulence with their infectivity. What that means is that the pathogen cannot be so virulent that it ends up killing its host before the latter gets a chance to transmit it. Thus, instead of pathogens and hosts evolving separately, the former to kill faster and the latter to become more efficient at defending itself against infection, both the pathogens and the immune systems of their host species need to co-evolve. That process, recent research has shown, has more to do with an increase in their levels of tolerance to one another than with an escalation of a warlike game where one side needs to be defeated for the other to survive. What these recent developments demonstrate is that the paradigms that sustain immunology have come a long way since immunity was first discovered. As authors like Ed Cohen and Roberto Esposito have argued, the modern body has until recently been understood as a private territory, with borders in constant need of defense against foreign invasion. From the mid-1600s onwards, with the borrowing of ideas of immunity as defense from political theory to medicine, and their subsequent strengthening thanks to Elie Metchnikoff's foundational immunological research in the late 1800s, modern thought has conceived the body as a discrete territory, defined through the enforcement of its borders with the outside environment. In Ed Cohen's words, the modern body aspires to localize human beings within an epidermal frontier that distinguishes the person from the world for the duration which we call a life. Thanks to the work of early immunologists, immunity came to be seen as a mechanism whereby a body establishes its biological self, its identity, and protects its integrity through a process of clear discrimination between the self and the non-self. There is a clear differentiation between what belongs in the body and what is foreign to it. Importantly, the emergence of the idea of immunity as defense occurred at the same time as wider medical discourses and institutions were being developed to govern life and to preside over the production of the subject, by managing the truth of the self in its difference from the other, what Michel Foucault names processes of governmentality and subjectivation. However, thanks to the developments in contemporary immunology that I've just mentioned, the clear border between self and non-self that was so central for modern understandings of immunity has become blurred as a result of what Alfred Tauber calls the ecological sensibility of contemporary biology. So according to Tauber, the body is no longer conceived as a discrete closed unit but as an ecosystem, and immunity ceased to be understood as a defense against foreign invasions and is now thought to be more of a process of interfacing, of mediated touch and exchange, in which foreign matter can be tolerated and incorporated in the interest of the organism, of its survival and crucially of its evolution. As a consequence, biological bodies are now thought to be heterogeneous, partially incorporating external entities and seen to exist in a co-constitutive relationship with their surroundings. Still, despite all that, Morris's desired vital symbiosis of human and viral DNA will at best only take place in a very distant future. At worst, it is nothing but intentionally controversial self-promotion by a pornographer who has built a career in subcultural celebrity status out of the controversy of his pornographic videos and public statements. Still, if we approach bareback simultaneously a porn subgenre and the de facto gay male sexual practice, in terms of what Paul Preciado calls the pharmacopornographic regime, we cannot so easily discount Morris's words. So by pharmacopornography, Preciado means the processes of a biomolecular, pharmaco, and semiotechnical pornographic government of sexual subjectivity that define contemporary biopolitics. Preciado argues that contemporary subjectivities are produced and maintained thanks to a system of chemical, semiotic, and technological prostheses that attach and plug into bodies, informing them as they do so, so that is by giving them both their form and their meaning. Building on Teresa de Lauretti's notion of technologies of gender, Preciado argues that the pharmacopornographic regime functions like a machine of somatic representation, in which text, image, and the corporeal spread through the interior of an expansive cybernetic circuit, and are responsible for creating the toxic pornographic subjectivities of our contemporary cyborg bodies. So those linguistic, imaginary, and material plugins operate as catalysts in processes of subjectivation, intervening within and feeding back into the body conceived as an interface. In that context, as one of a myriad of prostheses informing contemporary subjectivities through their mediation of desires and pleasures, pornographic videos code meanings and value systems and incorporate them in the bodies of particular sexual linguistic communities. As both sex and text, pornography is an important source for understanding how contemporary subjectivities are coded, performed, and at times hacked. Such an avenue of inquiry, however, must not only take into account what happens on screen, but must also consider the statements and institutions that surround and frame the sex depicted on screen. It is in that context that, departing from Paul Morris's discussion of his work, I want to focus on his video, on one of his videos entitled Viral Loads, in order to examine the ways in which it recodes, or it may recode, hegemonic masculinity and sexual intimacy. The reasons why I chose that particular pornographic video should become clearer as I kind of move on. So released in 2014, Viral Loads gathered media attention due to the ways in which it appears to eroticize HIV transmission. Its title refers both to the technical term used to name the number of viral particles in a milliliter of HIV-positive blood, and to the usage of the word load among barebackers as another name for ejaculate. So Viral Loads does not only promise us to show us men sharing their loads with one another, but also wants us to know, or at least to believe, that such loads are viral, that alongside semen they also carry HIV. So the film opens to the sound of a storm and a rotating globe with the words Team Global written on it, followed by Team's pirate-like logo of a black and white skull above two crossed swords. Once the sound changes to a meditative electronic drone, a variation on Team's logo appears on screen. Here the skull of the logo mutates into the head of a jester through the addition of a four-pointed hat reminiscent of the motley attire of medieval and Renaissance court entertainers. The insignia is completed by the Latin words Iocare serio e studiosissimo ludere, written in a thick serif typeface around the jester's skull. The whole thing conveys the overall impression of being a powerful sigil, one that suddenly comes alive when the skull's eyes light up in bright red. Before discussing its scenes, it is worth reflecting on the unique presence of this symbol, both at the start of viral loads and on the front cover of the DVD release. The symbol sets viral loads apart from all other Treasure Island media releases, which only use their regular logo and, unless they're thematic compilations of existing scenes, always have production shots on the front cover. So the viral loads insignia and its usage as the single image on the DVD front cover frames this particular porn video as a standout item in the studio's catalogue. So Iocare serio e studiosissimo ludere, meaning to jest in seriousness and to play in the greatest earnest, is a phrase associated with Marsilio Ficino's 1946 commentary on Plato's Parmenides. Appearing at the start of Ficino's preface to the work, the phrase concludes its opening sentence, which translates as, "It was the custom of Pythagoras, Socrates and Plato to conceal divine mysteries everywhere beneath figures and veils, to modestly dissimulate their wisdom in contrast to the sophist's arrogance, to jest in seriousness and to play in the greatest earnest." So discussed by Renaissance scholars, this passage has been read as an example of how for Ficino, philosophical wit had been used by Socrates to conceal and protect the higher truths of ancient theology. Further, this approach to philosophical method was part of a wider Renaissance interest in the wisdom of fools and in the connection the latter were seen to establish between the lowest and the most admirable, between body and soul, appearance and reality, the grotesque and the beautiful. Or as John Lepage, Ficino, kind of a Renaissance philosophy scholar, puts it, the unspeakable folly of human existence, the madness that in order to glimpse the truth, we must indulge in fictions or follow the imagination wherever it takes us. So, Paul Morris's allusion both to Ficino's Neoplatonism and to the figure of the jester at the start of viral loads complicates the pornographer's earlier views that stress the documentary nature of his work. By hinting at viral loads as an exercise in philosophical wit, Morris seems to willfully take up a new role, that of the wise fool. No longer embracing pornographic videos simply as a truthful record of reality, he hints at figures of rhetoric known for dissimulating truth with appearance, perhaps telling us that underneath the cover of his pornographic fantasy, he is offering us something else, a different grasp on reality. Through the intertextuality of the insignia with which he decided to open viral loads, he invites us to look beneath the veil of pornography and its depiction of raw sex to seek what kinds of thinking may be hiding in there. Not only that, but in requiring us to decipher the symbol, the pornographer as jester appears to be asking us to prove how deserving we are of the hidden knowledge he will supposedly have buried in his work. As he puts it in an interview with Vice, following the release of the video, the point of viral loads was for those people to whom it would make sense to look at it, say it, own it, and fucking move on. Fucking move on. In 20 years there will be references to HIV, and young gay men will astonish and horrify people who are now in their 20s when they say, "What the fuck are you talking about?" So with this statement, Morris hints at the double status of viral loads as both a pornographic text and some sort of manifesto for a post-AIDS future. So for him, eroticizing HIV and fantasizing about its transmission appears to be a means to foreground the structures that discipline our bodies and our pleasures. While doing so, he invites us to liberate and transform ourselves by staying true to what we desire. He who makes a beast of himself removes the pain of being human, claims the epigraph that appears on screen right after the gesture symbol. Morris's allusion to figures of rhetoric, the ways in which he discussed viral loads, and his uncharacteristic use of an epigraph at the start of the film all complicate the reading of the porn video. They add to the known difficulties in clearly defining pornography as a genre, whether through its content, its aesthetics, its politics, or what may be seen as its primary use, sexual gratification. Further adding to its intertextual complexity, Morris's promotional text for viral loads on his studio's online store is also rather opaque. So it reads, "Man sex is a virus, one that uses men as its host. Some try to resist it, others embrace it as the source of life and meaning." I always try to make like a really kind of gay bro voice here, but I don't know how to do that. But kind of, we live to breed the sex virus, to pass it on to every random anonymous dude we meet and fuck. It's how we reproduce, man. We shoot viral loads every time. Our jizz ain't for making babies. Our sex spreads like wildfire, squirting out of one man's dick, shooting deep inside another, then another, then another. Join it, buddy, you'll never look back. So, but what is really being said here? If, as the title implies, viral loads is about the eroticization of HIV transmission, why does Morris not name the actual virus? Instead, he seems to equate man sex with virus and uses the compound noun sex virus, allowing for multiple ways of decoding the text, including the one where it is not HIV but masculine sex, man sex itself, that spreads like wildfire and reproduces without babies. Interestingly, if we take up that reading, Morris's wiseful rhetoric starts unfolding in sharp contrast with the antisocial positions that have gained momentum in queer scholarship in the past decade. Calling for an embrace of negativity and the death drive, queer scholars like Lee Edelman have rejected politics on the grounds that all political projects, being future-orientated, necessarily inhabit heteronormative forms of temporality. They require heterosexual reproduction and depend on the figure of the child to whom the future is seen to belong. Against such antisocial or anti-relational stances, Morris's quote appears to allude to an alternative way in which the future may still be thought through contemporary queer forms of relationality and intimacy. In what I read as a rejection of Edelman's reduction of queerness to the death drive, Morris calls for the creation of new future-orientated forms of queer communion fueled by man sex spreading like wildfire and jizz that isn't used for making babies. Here, just like in his interview with Susanne Passonen that I've just quoted earlier, Morris appears to be claiming that his is a business that takes up a hedonistic present in order to fashion new queer communal futures. With that in mind, I would now like to turn to the actual scenes that make up the pornographic video. Viral Loads is comprised of 9 different scenes presented as chapters, each numbered and introduced by its title on the screen, followed by 2 bonus sequences. Through the numbering of each chapter, Viral Loads is given some degree of formal unity, which is also quite uncommon in kind of any porn release. So that unity is strengthened by the fact that scenes 1, 2, and 3, as well as the first bonus sequence, construct a singular narrative centered on the figure of Blue Bailey, whom the press pack describes as an uber whore. It is on that narrative that I'd like to focus, given its importance to the overall cohesion of the text. So, scene 1, adult bookstore basement fuck, is a one-to-one sexual encounter in which Bailey is fucked raw in the rough by Stephen Richards, whom Bailey addresses as Sir. It is structured around the progression, typical here, from oral sex to anal and back to oral, with the camera moving mostly between close-ups of penetration and close-ups of Bailey's face as he moans and grunts. The seeming roughness of the scene becomes complicated when Richards asks Bailey, you all good? Yeah? Is that okay? A series of questions that are also subtitled, hinting at the care that underlies the fantasy of submission. Eventually, the top ejaculates with a compromised money shot, but the scene does not end there. Instead, its temporality is expanded, with Richards continuing to fuck Bailey until the latter also ejaculates while rimming the former. Richard then collects Bailey's scum with his hands and feeds it to him, with the scene culminating with Richards, the top, calling Bailey, the bottom, a good boy, and a passionate kiss sharing Bailey's scum. This is making me thirsty. The following scene, Blue's Glory Hole Desert, is preceded by the text. 20 minutes later, before leaving the bookstore, Blue needed to taste the taste of more cock. As its title suggests, this is a scene of oral sex at the glory hole, one in which the camera maintains a continuous close-up of Bailey's face as he sucks an anonymous man to completion, only to then lick the drops of cum that fall on the floor. Despite the close-up shot, the reverberation of the ambient sounds helps to spatialize the scene in a much wider room where other men are heard moaning and coughing in the distance. Both scenes 1 and 2 lead up to a third scene, Blue's Man Worship Gangbang, which is described in the promotional text as having come about when, the day following the shoot in the adult bookstore, Blue Bailey approached Paul Morris saying that he, quote, wanted some kind of man worship initiation. So Blue Bailey approached Paul Morris. I read this. No. The resulting scene is one in which Bailey is fucked bareback by a large number of men. However, while the previous two scenes progressed in a linear fashion, scene 3 starts with its ending. And again, this is also very uncommon in anyone that watches porn. Nothing starts normally with the end, right? It's not common to see a scene starting with its end. So it opens with a close-up of a pig hole. So that utensil. Do I need to explain what it is?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's basically a butt plug, but it's open inside, so you can kind of access whatever place it is inserted in. So it opens with a close-up of a pig hole inserted in Bailey's rectum and another man's hand with most of his fingers inside it. The close-up cross-dissolves to a bedroom where Bailey is in bed on his fours, sucking one man and surrounded by several others. The camera cuts to one of the other men walking towards the foreground with a jar full of a white creamy content, which he extracts with a large pipette and inserts into Bailey's rectum through the opening of the pig hole. Fuck yeah, fill it up, keep going, drink it up, can be heard, uttered in the background under an echoing sound effect. So after that above sequence, a jump cut is applied and signaled by the text 1 hour earlier. So starting with a slow motion scene set to electronic music in which Bailey is seen kissing one man, we learn that the scene actually kicked off with Bailey being gang fucked while various men kissed and masturbated each other in the background, waiting for their turn with him. As an increasing number of men fuck and ejaculate inside Bailey, cum is seen dripping out of his ass, whose only role seems to be making sure no cum is wasted. So there is a strong sense of relentless giving and exchanging here, The relentlessness is heightened by the apparent consecutive loads that some men are seen depositing inside Bailey, often captioned by subtitles like Tom's second load or Logan's third load, and by the almost immediate transfer of the loads out of Bailey's ass and into Max X's mouth. The scene eventually leads to the closing jar sequence that we had already seen at the start. So in this iteration, however, the words "pause cum" can be read on the lid of the jar before its contents are injected into Bailey's ass. A clear attempt at circumventing the invisibility of HIV itself, as Tim Dean noted in his discussion of bareback porn. This second appearance of the jar sequence is also accompanied by a slowing down of the footage and the introduction of an electronic drone sound. The scene closes with Bailey and Max X kissing cum off each other's mouth, followed by a headshot of Bailey smiling as laughter is heard echoing in the background. So again, the whole sound landscape of this whole sequence is very atypical, I guess. So interestingly, it is not until the bonus features that the whole narrative becomes complete, and again by making use of yet another jump cut. It is only then, after 6 other unrelated scenes, that we are eventually shown the cum being collected to fill the jar that was introduced in scene 3. Making use of an uncharacteristic 3x3 split screen, we see 9 men sat on chairs, filmed only from their necks down, masturbating into the jar, adding their contribution to what, according to the press pack, were 200 pause loads. Just like the word "pause cum" was deployed, just like the words "pause cum" were deployed to overcome the invisibility of HIV, anonymity functions here in much the same way, to strengthen the affective charge of the fantasy. By not showing the faces of the men in this last sequence, Morris intensifies the aesthetics of transgression pursued with viral loads. Considering that the vast majority of team models are clearly recognizable by their faces and listed on the company's online roster, Morris's decision to play with anonymity in this instance further contributes to the reality effect that he's pursuing with the film. Particularly so, given that the scene was filmed in a legal context that still allows for criminal prosecutions for consciously exposing someone to HIV and potentially infecting them. So invisibility and anonymity as absences that serve as proxies to the presence of HIV thus strengthen the sexual fantasy of infection that viral loads appears to be kind of pursuing. Considering that none of the actual sex scenes depicted are fundamentally different from most other scenes in Tim's catalogue, the controversy surrounding viral loads is not just the result of the sex we see, but rather of its style and the sophisticated way in which Morris, the witty jester, makes use of intertextuality to play with presence and absence, visibility and invisibility. By doing so, he alludes to what Linda Williams describes as the perpetual push and pull between onsinity and obscenity, as a part of the neoliberal dilemma of an ever-expanding market for all sorts of sexual representations. It is those stylistic decisions that to me set viral loads apart as a pornographic work. Rather than simply sticking to the conventions of style that have become Tim's signature, Paul Morris's play with temporality through non-linear editing, his use of explicit audio effects, which again contradicts the whole ethnographic ethos that he used to have in earlier videos. So his use of explicit audio effects and entrancing drone sounds, chapter-like scenes, and even a split screen all add to the aforementioned jester symbol and cryptic epigraph to tell us that what we see in viral loads is likely to be not what viral loads is really about. Its truth effect becomes further disrupted by the realization that Blue Bailey was already living with HIV and with an undetectable viral load at the time the post-cum scene was shot. Concealment, this time of the model's own serostatus, is used again to benefit the fantasy, or as Bailey himself put it in an interview, to hype the film up. Even if that were not the case, medical evidence suggests that the virus itself can only survive outside the human body in very specific conditions. So the HIV transmission has not been reported as a consequence of contact with spillages of blood, semen, or other bodily fluids. So in that sense, even if there was, HIV, a kind of charged cum in that jar, the virus would have, broken down by the time it was used for the scene. So to my mind, what viral loads offers beneath its play of artifice and reality is thus a rich text through which to think the ways in which post-AIDS gay masculinities may complicate modern understandings of the body and the autonomous subject. My position here resonates both with Morris's manifested interest in human viral symbiosis, and also with Gregory Thompson's view that barebacking supplements masculine subjectivity through the accumulation of foreign matter into the body. Viral loads uses pornographic and narrative devices both to reassert masculinity as an ideal and to queer it. So on the one hand, through heroically enduring relentless penetrations and accumulations of bodily fluids, Blue Bailey reiterates masculinity as athleticism and endurance. On the other hand, and as Byron Lee also noted in relation to the masculinity of bareback bottoms, by reframing masculine athleticism as relentless bottoming, what was once an act of effeminacy is now seen as a masculine act. So the being penetrated. So viral loads reproduces masculine ideals while nonetheless queering them through both the penetrability of Bailey's body and its radical porosity to foreign matter, so to its impurity. So this performance of masculinity simultaneously... Oh, I moved that. This performance of masculinity, simultaneously athletic and impure, gains a particular relevance in the context of the biopolitics of highly active antiretroviral therapy, which is administered as either treatment as prevention or pre- and post-exposure HIV prophylaxis, so PrEP or PEP. After all, as Blue Bailey noted, most HIV-positive models working in porn live with undetectable viral loads thanks to successful antiretroviral regimes. Notwithstanding the fantasy of HIV transmission depicted in the film, the reality is that thanks to antiretrovirals, the bodies we see exchanging semen with one another are likely to exist outside of the positive-negative binary upon which the seroconversion it eroticizes would depend. So constituted as a third option between positivity and negativity, HIV undetectability simultaneously increases sexual freedom while subjecting the body to increasing biomolecular control. In other words, while undetectability allows a queering of Bailey's masculinity through a relentless embrace of penetrability and porosity to inhuman matter, so to kind of viruses, the biopolitics of antiretroviral drugs reinscribes Bailey's subjectivity within the masculine norm as a heroic form of life, at once allowing his exposure to risk and chemically shielding him from it. So it is in this context, it is in the context of such kind of post-human becoming, one in which the affordances of flesh, desire, and pleasure are at once increased by foreign matter and semiotic chains and recaptured by biopolitical economies, that viral loads can be read as a kind of jester's wit, a pornographic fantasy that alludes to important changes in how gay male subjectivities are embodied and performed in a post-AIDS context. Thanks to the techno-scientific developments that have been taking place since the late 1990s, the masculinity performed in viral loads cannot be fully captured by earlier understandings of bodies as enclosed spaces. Instead, viral loads enacts masculinity through opening the body to a seemingly endless number of loads to foreign matter. At the same time, however, those bodies remain protected as standing reserves of life by being chemically reconditioned with antiretroviral drugs. So emerging at the biopolitical intersection of semiotic, chemical, and corporeal feedback loops, I see Bailey's masculinity as a form of what Preciado calls toxic pornographic subjectivities. both his body and his subjectivity emerge as kind of cyborg or chimeric interfaces, where strict distinctions between self and other collapse in a relentless circulation of pornographic images, chains of meaning, and inhuman matter. Viral loads then poses some important questions concerning the relationship between subjectivity and community, between the one and the many. As Kane Race notes, antiretrovirals reiterate the sovereignty of the neoliberal subject through self-administration. By self-administering antiretrovirals, gay men also actively administer themselves in what constitutes a devolution of biopolitical control from medical institutions to the self-monitoring individual and his, to quote Race, personal acts of consumption and compliance. So part of the wider privatization of experience that characterizes the neoliberal politics of self-care, antiretrovirals moved HIV away from the public sphere, where the politics of the AIDS crisis unfolded or had unfolded, and into the private bodies of individuals, where life is now regulated by self-administered chemical prostheses. However, as both Race and Preciado also argue, the emergence of a new privatized and self-managed biochemical theatre of biopolitical operations did not mark the end of queer communities and queer ways of imagining futures. What it did instead was to create the conditions for queerness and community to be thought differently and projected into the future through new ways of queering structures of power and hegemonic subjectivities. What Preciado associates with practices of hacking bodies, chains of meaning, pleasures, and formations of desire. That is, an appropriation of the new prosthesis and contrasexual becoming of the body away from its status as a unit of life and labor and towards new modes of relating with, fucking, and touching one another. In short, an appropriation of biotechnology to foster new forms of community and belonging. So in his book, Unlimited Intimacy, Tim Dean claims that barebacking is worthy of academic attention as a subcultural practice due to the ways in which, as a form of biosociality, it catalyzes new structures of kinship and non-normative queer identification through the sharing of HIV. However, as I've just argued, antiretroviral drugs have complicated that narrative of biosociality and kinship. So much so that in a more recent article, Dean himself has had to readjust his earlier view of barebacking to what he now sees as the mediation of intimacy by antiretroviral drugs. Still, the biopolitics of biochemical self-management is also what allows for the pharmaceutically mediated utopia that viral loads depicts. Still, the biopolitics of biochemical self-management is also what allows for the pharmaceutically mediated utopia that viral loads depicts, making the pornographic text a productive source for rethinking not only gay masculinities, but also community formations in a post-AIDS world. Understanding community in terms of attributes that are recognized as shared by the members of a group is a long-established position in the social sciences. Traced back to the likes of Victor Turner, that position sees community being triggered by a recognition of the attributes the membership holds in common, and that therefore allow members to overcome their individual differences. The problem when it comes to forms of community predicated on the sharing of HIV is that the antiretroviral regimes that make fantasies like viral loads possible also prevent the fantasy of HIV transmission to become a reality. Antiretrovirals make positive bodies uninfectious and negative bodies uninfectable. They operate as a chemical barrier to the sharing of HIV. So nonetheless, following my reading of viral loads, there is still a strong sense of intimacy, complicity, and care among the models that we see in the film. Intimacy is read in tops asking bottoms whether they're enjoying it, in tops being depicted making Blue Bailey's wishes a reality, in their giggles, their smiles, their laughter, and their passionate kissing. So all those expressions of communion hint at the fact that despite the ways in which antiretrovirals may function as part of wider processes of neoliberal self-management, that they still create conditions of possibility for new forms of touch and sociability to emerge in a world where bodies and desire are hypermediated and saturated by images, language, technology, drugs, and pleasures. However, in order to understand how that may be happening, we must stop understanding community as only possible among those who have things in common. In his study of community, Esposito traces the etymology of communities back to munus, the Latin word that kind of hovers between duty and gift. Rather than emerging out of a sharing economy, Esposito claims that communitas is in fact about gifting something to another unconditionally, about, he writes, a pledge or a tribute that one pays in an obligatory form. His line of thinking also resonates with Massimo De Angeli's recent work on the nature of the commons, in which the political theorist argues that the commons must not be understood as a set of goods or resources held in common by a group of people. Instead, they must be regarded as a dynamic system of social relations, as a doing in common that carries existing and new social relations into a collective future. To go back to viral loads, I would like to argue that in the context of antiretrovirals, the communities enacted on screen are similarly not predicated on something concrete being held in common by the men we see fucking and being fucked by one another. Instead, they are enacted in the relentless giving and receiving of foreign matter, made possible through the radical embrace of the openness and porosity of their bodies. In viral loads, the exchange of bodily fluids emerges as a form of commoning, as a community in becoming, so kind of a doing in common, rather than a sharing in common. So what such perspective allows is for a better grasp of Blue Bailey's incessant pursuit of load after load, only to then pass them away into the mouths and of others. In viral loads, no load is ever held in place, and as such, no load is held in common. Instead, what we see is a community coming together, even if for only a few hours, through relentless acts of giving and exchanging, through an incessant eroticization and actualization of the porous potential of the body to that which would normally be thought not to belong there, to inflows of foreign matter. So rather than having their subjectivity dependent on a clear separation of self and other, the bodies we see depicted in viral loads suggest themselves as perverse realities. They are porous, penetrable, multiple, and self-constituted in their openness to strangers. In operating their boundaries not as closed borders but as interfaces, they veer away from modern understandings of the human as a discrete self-enclosed unit. That is, even if the bodies we see in viral loads are made possible thanks to antiretroviral drugs, even if the biopolitics of the latter still perpetuate the sovereignty of the self-administering neoliberal subject, that sovereignty also creates the possibility that those same bodies may fashion themselves differently as radically impure queer multitudes. So organized around the coming together, there is also a coming inside. The barebacking communities depicted in viral loads operate a displacement of the self. So in them, the self becomes multiple. In so doing, their libidinal excesses push bodies towards an inhuman mode of touch. While they certainly embrace and stress some aspects of normative masculinity, they no longer posit masculinity itself as either impermeable or immutable. Instead, the masculine embodiments we see enacted in viral loads are toxic, not necessarily or not just toxic in the sense of oppressive to others, but toxic in and for themselves. That is, through opening themselves to what is foreign, both their masculinity and their humanity become self-polluting. They themselves become matter out of place, to use Mary Douglas's famous definition of dirt. So in that context, their community ethics is no longer dependent on what bodies may have in common with one another. Instead, community becomes a pledge one makes to others on the condition that they will remain foreign and strange, not in spite of it. And I actually think there's a lot of things that can be kind of extrapolated from here to think even about like migration politics and all sorts of things. So the kind of as a different mode of relating to kind of the foreignness of bodies by maintaining their kind of foreignness, or by upholding their foreignness. So as such, viral loads advances a masculinity that is always already queer, polluted and impure. At the same time, through the relentless flows of semen, foreign DNA and antiretroviral drugs it depends on, the porn video presents as a view of contemporary embodied subjectivities as compromises in living together. In so doing, it not only functions as a critique of the modern autonomous subject and of his idealized bodily integrity, but it also constitutes a serious invitation for us to think the queer futures of our bodies, coded as they are through the interfacing of visual, semiotic, libidinal, and biochemical prosthetic flows. That's it. Thanks.